Okay, so without further ado, here's Jaakko Lehtinen, and he's going to talk about what he did or what he said last week's SIGGRAPH. So let's give him a big hand.
Thank you. Thank you. So I have a lot to talk about, so let's get right into it. But first, I'll say a few words of who I am and why I'm talking to you today. So I started out as a teenager. I went to work for Remedy right after high school, where I had my hand in the Max Payne games. Some of you may have actually played these games. I wrote code that's responsible for most of the pixels that you see on screen on these games, including how the environments are modeled, textures, lit, and scripted. I also had my hand in Alan Wake, but during that time I went to grad school to do a PhD in the former Helsinki University of Technology, which I completed in 2007, after which I went to work to Boston, to Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where I did research for close to 3 years, after which I moved back to Helsinki and started working for NVIDIA Research. But last September, I also started as an assistant professor at Aalto University, as the first ever professor in this country who specializes in graphics and rendering in particular. So I'm going to talk about some recent research that we've done. I have 2 projects that I'm going to try and give you a flavor of. But so before we go there, I'd like to use a few words or a few minutes to talk about what actually research means. You think of movies, games, demos, whatever, and that's usually development work. You work on projects and you have products to ship and so forth. How's research different from this? So here's a tree that's sideways. Now this is just the same tree inverted, and I'm going to use this as a metaphor for for the progression of knowledge. So here's the state of the art. We've seen what comes before. We've written our games, movies, or whatever, and this is how far we've come in our technical ability. And when you do something new, you just you take some particular subset of technology, you nudge it forward, and that's the new state of the art, right? I mean that's as simple as it goes. However, there's something really gravely wrong with this picture, and that is that we don't actually see the entire tree ahead of time. We've only come this far. How could we possibly know what's out there at the right? It's sort of at the same thing as we're driving a race car with our low beams on. We only see so far up ahead. So how do we know where to go? Obviously, the state of the art where it is right now, it gives us some idea of what are the pain points that we actually have to improve on next. But often it happens, or it can happen, that there are greater rewards to be reaped somewhere not in the immediate in directions that are not immediately obvious from where the state of the art is currently. And that is precisely the job of research, to be the high beams or kaukovalot in a race car that sort of points the way towards discoveries that may not be immediately obvious or immediately realizable given where you are currently in your production. And so it's the job of research to trace out all these possible paths out into the future, to sort of venture a guess on, what if we did this? Entertain a thought, entertain the thought, see where it takes you, and come up with answers to questions that people might not even asked in production yet. Here's the catch, though. Well, some of these paths will not lead to anything useful, or may appear to not lead to anything useful. Of course, this happens. Like you don't always succeed. But the catch is really that you cannot know this in advance. You cannot know this in advance. Who of you knows what the Z buffer is? Okay, almost all of you. Great. So when Ed Catmull proposed the Z buffer in, I think, 1974, he's one of the Pixar founders, people told him, Ed, you're crazy. That takes so much memory, it'll never work. And if you know how your GPU works today, that is exactly how modern renderers figure out what's in front of what when you draw pixels, right? And yet they told him, Ed, you're crazy. So what makes sense technically changes over time as our hardware platforms evolve. We get single scalar thread performance pretty much stopped getting any faster around 2003, 10 years ago. Like if you look at the clock frequencies, how many instructions you can put through in a CPU in a single thread, that has not gone up. It's actually gone down in the past 10 years. Obviously, there are things that like better caches and branch predictors and what have you. But that's still the story. And to get more performance these days, we just have to go wide and parallel. And this is one of the things that changes, over time, which algorithms actually make sense, right? So on a broad level, how science or research works is you think of new stuff, what if we did this? Could we actually get to this pot of gold far ahead, which is not immediately obvious from where we are right now. So then, once you come up with these ideas, it's your job to beat everything that's out there already before you. You really have to push the state-of-the-art forward by some measurable amount. Then, once you've done this, you've proved that your idea works and it's better, you write it up in a paper. You submit this paper to peer review, where people who do research in the same areas, usually anonymously, take a look at what you did, and then they say either yay or nay. And if they say yay, you get published, and that's profit. Now, given where we are right now, you may notice that this is not entirely unlike a demo competition, right? The difference is that you don't have to beat whoever decided to submit entries to the competition today. You have to beat everybody who did anything like in that topic ever before, right? But then again, you can pick your battles. In a demo compo, you compete against everything, not just that single line of research. So graphic research happens in universities and industrial research labs. In Helsinki, graphics research, happens basically in two places. Research that aims at publishing academically and taking the state-of-the-art forward happens in two places. I have a new group that I'm building at Aalto, which consists currently of 3 PhD students. They're really bright kids. One of them is an engine writer for Remedy, which is what I did back in the day as well. And we do research in rendering and appearance capture, which is one of the topics that I'm going to talk about later. And the other place is NVIDIA Research. NVIDIA is the company that makes GPUs, as probably most of you know. And we are 4 senior researchers working on rendering and hardware architectures in Ruoholahti. One of the highlights of the work of our group, that our group is doing in Ruoholahti, is that we have built the fastest end-to-end ray tracing systems in the world. If you give us, geometry and a bunch of rays, we will give you answers to these ray triangle queries faster than anybody on this planet. So I'm going to talk about 2 papers that we presented last week at SIGGRAPH. Who of you has heard of SIGGRAPH before? Okay, great. So I don't have to go into lengthy explanations. But suffice it to say that it's both an organization and an annual conference. And the academic track of this conference is the most prestigious forum you can possibly publish in graphics. We seldom get to write papers that appear in Nature or Science, unfortunately. We're so specialized. But maybe that should be our next goal. Anyhow, so the first paper I'm going to talk about is Gradient Domain Metropolis Light Transport, which is a collaboration between myself, my NVIDIA colleagues, Tero, Samuli, and Timo, my student, Mika from Aalto, and my former postdoc advisor, Fredo, from MIT. And since there's a lot to talk about and not a whole lot of time, we'll just dive right in. Who of you have seen Lena before? Okay, you've read your image processing literature, great. So you don't usually see Lena in rendering talks. Usually you do stuff like this, basic image processing. Like here, I'm taking 1 pixel and I'm I'm taking the pixel next to it and I'm subtracting these 2 from each other. When I do this for all the pixels in this image, who can guess what comes out? Yes. Sorry. Yes, exactly. Embossed sideways. We've all seen this 1,000 times before as well. If I do the same for the vertical difference, or the vertical direction, I get a picture that looks like this. If I put them two together, I get the image derivative or gradient. And the image gradient has, it's a classic observation that when you take the derivative of an image, the result is sparse. What does sparse mean? It means that in most of the areas in this image, the value of this gradient, or the magnitude of this gradient or derivative, is going to be close to 0. There are going to be a few places, like on the edges and in areas of texture, where I have high values. But in most of the image, it's actually very close to 0. So we've sort of compressed the information in this image to a much smaller set of pixels, if you will, because the gradient or the derivative, it really contains the same information as the original image, except for one number, the overall brightness, right? Because when you differentiate, you lose constants. But so it is a much more succinct representation for the same information. I hope I've convinced you of that. Now, since we're doing rendering, this led us last year to ask, could we possibly render derivatives directly? And if we could we do it in a fashion that uses automatically less computation in areas of the final image that are smooth, and puts more more computation in areas where you actually have stuff happening in the image? Now, this is an obvious chicken and egg problem, since how do you know where those gradients are if you don't have the image and have the capability of actually subtracting these pixels from each other? And if I don't have the gradients, how do I get the final image back? So our desired algorithm looks something like this. So we somehow come up with these horizontal and vertical finite differences, which is just basically the embossed images that I showed in the beginning. We feed them to some procedure that gives the final image given these gradients. So this is called a Poisson solver, because it amounts to solving a second-order elliptic partial differential equation, but there's a more intuitive name for that. Now, obviously, this is something we know how to do. Once we have a derivative, we can just integrate it and get the result back. This is really where the big question is: how the hell do we get gradients without knowing where the image actually is? The second part is easy. Once we know the gradient of something, the gradient of Lena is these two things. The fundamental theorem of calculus more or less says that we can take the gradient and swap it into an integral sign on the other side, and that's it. No more magic in that. We're working in the field of very classical light transport or rendering algorithms called path sampling algorithms. They are different from many kinds of rendering algorithms like photon mapping. Who's heard of photon mapping? Okay, half of you maybe. These algorithms are special in the sense that they're guaranteed to give you the correct result on average. This may not sound like much, but it actually makes a big difference, because a lot of rendering algorithms are based on different kinds of heuristics and tunable parameters, and they're not actually guaranteed to give you the right answer. But these algorithms are, and we aim to formulate an algorithm that is as well. And so, when we're drawing a picture, really the question is, for each visible point, how much light goes towards my camera? It's as simple as that. It's called radiance, this quantity. And the observed lighting is the sum of direct light, the light that's bounced once over all possible points in the scene, light that's bounced twice over all possible combinations of 2 points in that scene, over 3 times, and so forth. It's actually infinitely complex, mathematically speaking. Light can theoretically bounce infinitely, an infinite number of times after leaving the source and hitting your sensor. So a really simple path sampling algorithm is called Monte Carlo path tracing, which just means that we randomly sample the space of all possible paths that light can take from the source to the sensor. And that works roughly by just shooting a ray from the camera, checking if there's any light coming to that point, if so, recording it to the image, then shooting a reflected ray according to the reflectance function at this visible point, checking if there's any light coming through to that direction, and then continuing on from there probabilistically. And you do this a lot of times for each pixel. So you get a different path and different contribution from this path every time. You just do this a lot, and then you average the results. If you do this enough, you get a picture that looks pretty nice. If you don't do this enough, you get a picture that looks crappy. But it's still, if you render this one sample per pixel image, a large number of times and take the average, you get this. You get the actual correct answer. That's what it means that it's unbiased. However, none of this stuff is directly usable for computing image derivatives. These paths that we sample only tell us about how much light flows through each one of these paths, and we're taking random samples. How do we know if we're interested in derivatives? These algorithms do not help us at all. However, there's one particular algorithm due to Eric Veach and Leo Gibas in SIGGRAPH 97 that works. It works in the same space in that it samples all the possible paths that light can take from the source to the sensor. But it does so slightly differently. It constructs what's called a Markov chain of light paths, which means that once the algorithm, you initialize it somehow, you find a path, a light path where there's lots of light flowing through. Then what the algorithm does is it sort of looks nearby to other paths that are similar to this one path. And if it happens to find another path that carries a lot of light that's close to this one path, it sort of jumps over to that path. And then it continues this local exploration of this set of paths so that it sort of finds out, once it locks on to something, lots of light goes through here, then it really finds all the other paths that are nearby and sort of gets you a result much, much faster than these more naive algorithms in difficult situations. This algorithm has the absolutely remarkable property that it tends, by doing this, actually I should mention still, that the algorithm works by just walking around the space of paths, moving onto light paths that are nearby, and then in the end, you just count how many paths. Sorry, wrong slide. In the end, you just count how many paths landed at each pixel. And so this just means that your sampler sort of jumps around in image space and also in the space of light paths. So as I was saying, this algorithm has the really remarkable property that it directs computation to regions or to paths where lots of light flows, and it does so without knowing where these paths are in advance. This is the power of Markov chains. Once you find a path that carries a lot of light, you're sort of almost guaranteed to find the other paths of light that are important as well. But it does not require you to know where these are in advance. It's an emergent property of the algorithm that it does so. And now this is really, our key insight is simply, how do we do this in gradient domain? We simply concentrate sampling on paths where light flow changes across pixels. We don't measure how much light is going through this path. We measure how much the light flow changes between this path and a path that's, that's next to it by just one pixel. And it turns out this will give us directly image gradients. And so let's see how that works by a simple 2D example. Here I have a camera looking at a receiving surface. I have a light source and an occluder. This is all in 1D, but you get the picture. I mean, the same thing in 3D. And so we're going to be looking at light paths of length 2. They leave the eye, they hit the receiver, and they go to some point on the light source. And so they're, we're going to be interested in all these paths. This particular path is blocked because it's hitting the occluder. And so now I'm going to lay out all these possible paths of light onto a 2D coordinate system, and I'm going to index the x-coordinate in this 2D coordinate system. I'm going to index by the coordinate on the receiver, and the y-coordinate, or the vertical coordinate, I'm going to index by the coordinate of the point over the light source. So I have 2 points, one here, one here. I'm laying their coordinates in orthogonal directions in this 2D grid. And so this just means that one path one path that leaves here, hits here, is one particular point in this 2D diagram. Does that make sense? Great. And so to each point in this 2D diagram, I'm going to associate a function that says whether or not there's light flowing through this path. So for all paths that are not blocked, I'm just going to say, OK, there's 1 unit of light going through. That means all this yellow area has value 1, and the paths that are blocked have a value of 0. OK? And so how do you render shadows from an area light source? For each visible point, you have to sum over all the possible points on your light source, which is, mathematically speaking, it's called integration. And you're going to sum up the radiance from all of those points into that direct point, or into that visible point. And in this diagram, it just means that we're going to take this thing, and we're going to flatten it by integrating over the vertical directions. And that just means we get a one-dimensional function. The result, once we integrate this function over the y-axis, we get a result that looks like that. Don't be afraid of integration. It just means that for this particular pixel over at the left, which is entirely in shadow, it means that the resulting lighting is 0. Then there's a penumbra region where some of the light source is visible and some of it is not. It's going to have a linear ramp from 0 to fully lit. And then in this region where the entire light source is visible, it's going to have a constant value of 1. Okay? And so what Metropolis light transport does, it gives us paths that are distributed according to how much light is carried by each path. In this example, it means that we get, once the sampler walks around in the space of light paths that, as I explained before, we get, in the end, a distribution of samples that is roughly uniform over the lit portion of this path space. And we get no samples at all in the shadowed part. And so, but when we look at the rendered result, we notice that in this area that's fully lit, we've actually wasted most of our sample budget in this region of path space. Clearly, this is not something that, intuitively, you should be putting more effort where stuff actually happens, right? But this is not something that any unbiased rendering algorithm to date can do. So our idea is, as I actually already gave away, is to not measure light throughput over paths, but the difference in light throughput over pairs of paths. And what that means is that I'm going to take a path, I'm going to construct another path that has, starts from the same point, ends at the same point, but it's offset by 1 pixel from this other path. And in the path space diagram, it means that it's just a pair of points that are 1 pixel across like this, right? And so here's one pair of paths. So in this case, both of them are unblocked, so the difference is 0. And the same goes here. In this case, one of them is blocked, and the other one isn't. So we get, our algorithm detects that, OK, here's something going on. Now the difference is, this pair of paths is somehow meaningful because there's difference in how much light flows through. And so I'm not going to go into the details of how this works, but in the end, our sampler, once we run it, it puts a lot of samples along the shadow boundary in path space and some samples in the lit region so that we get an idea of how much light there is in general. But it really samples the interesting part of path space well, unlike the previous algorithm. And so once we're done, we just count the positive and negative contributions at each pixel, and this really gives us the gradient, the image gradient that we were looking for initially. So let me pause for a second. We have managed to compute the gradient or derivative of an image without knowing what the image was beforehand. And we've managed to do this in a way that actually puts effort where there are large contributions to this gradient, and done this in an unbiased manner, which means that there are some guarantees as to the mathematical correctness of this algorithm. We believe we're the first ones ever to have managed this. And then all that remains is that we take these gradients and integrate them to get the final image. Of course, there's lots of advanced mathematics involved in all of this. In particular, we've had to, this is really the hardest things that we ever had to do, is that once we map these paths between pixels, we have to take into account the fact that we're actually changing integration variables. And it took us 4 guys, probably 2 or 3 weeks full-time work time to get it done. But we managed in the end, and that's great. So no technical details. I don't have time to go into all of our results. Suffice it to say that in this scene, where the light transport is extremely difficult, there's a large area light source behind this door that's slightly ajar. And all of the light in this picture is indirect. It is coming through from the other side of the door, it bouncing off the door into the wall, and then onto the room here, and onto there, and then into the camera. And very smart rendering algorithms, say, given 20 minutes, don't give you a result that look very good. Some slightly smarter rendering algorithms don't do a whole lot better. Original Metropolis light transport gives us a much better image given the same time. And our algorithm gives still a yet significantly better looking image in this same amount of time. I invite you to look at the paper and the results. Unfortunately, I have no time to go into it any further. But so to conclude this part of the talk, we believe that we've actually managed to stumble upon a fundamentally novel method for unbiased light transport that drives computation effort towards where things happen, so to speak. And it does so without relying on heuristics. We believe we are the first ones to ever do this. This has, of course, interesting connections to previous adaptive sampling algorithms that do not share the attractive unbiasedness properties of these samplers. And we believe that by synthesizing these ideas, we've hopefully given follow-up research lots of exciting directions to go. All right. I'm going to take questions only at the end because I still have another project to talk about. So, which is, I'm unfortunately going to have to switch presentation systems since my student works in PowerPoint and I work in Keynote. So, this is another project that is not about rendering. It is capturing the appearance of the real world so that it can be reproduced in renderings efficiently. We all know that, the best engine in the world doesn't mean shit if you don't have talented people who create content for you, models and audio and textures and so forth. And in this work, we focus on the surface appearance of materials. Lots of real-world surfaces have really interesting, subtle detail in their appearance. Like you have different gloss, different texture, different tactile feel to all of these surfaces, right? And it is really our observation is that what gives these surfaces their character is not their geometry necessarily, but it is how their local microstructure changes over space, and how their color and glossiness changes over space. And of course, we all know that you can reproduce these effects by normal maps and gloss maps, but if I give you a rendering that looks like this, I hope you'll agree that it does not look quite the same as those photographs that I showed. So our goal is to capture the rich spatial variation in reflectance using only standard office hardware and produce output that is directly usable by modern rendering engines. So a brief detour. Who's heard of the BRDF? Half of you, maybe. It's just the function that says, for each incoming light direction, what's the distribution of outgoing light? And that encodes the surface appearance pretty well. Spatially varying, or SVBRDF, just means that this reflectance changes over space. And here's just a simple illustration. Diffuse plus slightly specular material on this teapot. For each, for this particular lighting direction, the distribution of outgoing light is just this diffuse bump and this specular highlight bump. You probably know all of this pretty much by hand. So, of course, we're not the first ones to think about this problem. There's lots and lots of work that uses expensive custom-built hardware. I'm not going to talk about that. Then there's lots of heuristics that can produce nice results, but don't necessarily reproduce the actual appearance of materials very well. But I'm sorry, I'll have to skip through a lot of these slides real quick. But so our design goals are to have a static system with no moving parts that you can build from off-the-shelf components that you probably already own, have an automated capture setup, and capture materials that can be represented using a diffuse color, specular, and glossiness, and a normal map. And we do this using a setup that looks like this. So here we have an approximately flat material sample. We use a monitor as a programmable area light source, and we have an SLR camera that looks at this. What we're going to do is we're going to show some patterns onto the monitor. This is the sample. That's the monitor. We're going to show some patterns of light on this monitor and observe. We're going to take pictures. We're going to observe how these patterns are reflected off the sample, and we're going to try and deduce what the reflectance and normals are based on this information. And of course, in the real world, light rays leave the emitter. They reflect off the sample and find the camera. But just as well, because light flow can be reversed, we can think of this as for each pixel in our image, tracing a ray, seeing how these sort of vision or importance rays get reflected and find the screen. These two are pretty much the same thing. And so what happens when we take a picture? So each pixel in the camera, we assume that the BRDF is the sum of diffuse and specular lobes. And because this is just a directional quantity, we can project this BRDF onto the plane of the monitor. And so this gives us a slice of the BRDF, including both the diffuse component and the specular component, right? And it's important to observe that this slice encodes all the effects of how specular it is. It has the width of this thing. Determines that. What diffuse color it is determines the color of this projection. However, we cannot observe this projection directly because that's not the monitor does not record light; it emits light. So what we have to do is we emit these patterns on the screen, and the reflectance equation says that the value of each pixel in my image is the integral of the product of this guy and the pattern that we showed on the screen. And so for each pixel in the image, we get one color, and this changes over space. So this different point, it still has the same illumination, but it has a different BRDF slice. So like so, but we get a different integral out of that thing. So our high-level plan is to take these pictures, showing these patterns, try to deduce what the hell is going on. And the question now is, what patterns should we use in order to be able to do this? And we use what's called windowed Fourier patterns. I'm not going to bore you with details of why this is important. I'm just saying that these are waves of different frequencies and orientations. So here, we have a diagonal one. We have one that's, that has more waves in it, and so forth. And the pictures, again, this is just a recap of what I showed before. The pictures look like this. So who's heard of the Fourier transform? Almost all of you. Fantastic. It's a wonderful tool for a lot of things. It turns out that once we show these windowed patterns on the screen, what we're actually doing is we are taking samples of the Fourier transform of this unknown slice of the BRDF. So each one, here I'm representing the Fourier transform of this BRDF slice as magnitude and phase, and this, in here I have four horizontal cycles in my emission pattern. That corresponds to this one particular point on the complex plane in the Fourier transform. This one that has more waves corresponds to a higher frequency, and the diagonals correspond to different frequencies on the diagonal. We just show these different orientations of waves, and that means that we get point samples of the Fourier transform of this BRDF slice. If you don't follow me precisely, don't worry. It's all designed to sound fancy. But I'm gonna also show you that it works. So what's really special about these Fourier measurements is that all the effects that we're interested in, like normals and the glossiness and the color, they have clear interpretations in these Fourier coefficients. That means that when we take these samples from the spectrum, here I'm just looking at a slice, I'm seeing that there's a slight bump in the beginning in the low frequencies. That corresponds to the diffuse low frequency component of this reflectance function. The specular, or the high frequency part, corresponds to the specular lobe right there. And if I consider a BRDF that's much more glossy, almost mirror-like, so that that goes almost into a dot, then the spectrum looks like this. So it means that there's significant power remaining in also the higher frequencies that we capture. But so that's just to illustrate that the diffuse part doesn't change very much when we change the glossiness of the specular part, but when the specular gets more narrow, it has this effect in the higher parts of the frequency spectrum. And so we know very well that the decay rate of these things corresponds to glossiness roughly. But the key thing is that once we've observed only a few of these frequencies, we can extrapolate these out into infinite frequencies and get a very smooth, nice representation of the reflectance. The heights of these things corresponds to colors and albedos, if you will. Okay, I'm not going to go into any more of that. So, but what's really going on is that when we take these photos, these implicitly give us point samples of the Fourier spectrum of this BRDF slice. And now our job is to explain these observations in terms of unknown normals, unknown albedos, and so on. And I am going to skip all of the details of which there are many in the order of finishing on time. But so this is the most math that I've ever showed in a talk before, but it's all visual. So in the end, what the magic is that we build a computational model that, given albedos, normals, and glossinesses, explains the observed reflectance slices using mixtures of Gaussian functions, which is basically just the normal distribution. Who's heard of the Gaussian function? Almost half of you. Fantastic. And it has the very, very nice property that you can analytically Fourier transform this, which makes our optimizer really fast. So the job of the optimizer is then just to figure out what these unknown things are in order to explain the data. I apologize for going so fast over this thing. I used more time than I wanted on the first part. But let's look at some results. It's all fancy math mumbo jumbo, but here I'm showing a comparison of a photograph lit by an area light source on the left, and on the right you can see our reproduction, our rendering of the same scenario of this material sample. What's going on in here is that I have two triangles. It's a quad made out of two triangles that has our our SVBRDF reflectance model pasted onto it. And this is something that can be evaluated in real time. This material sample is a crumpled piece of paper with clear tape on it. So the paper is almost diffuse. The tape is almost mirror-like. And you can see that the appearance of these two things is, I can't really tell the difference, which was obviously the goal before. And this can be done, as I said, in real time. Here's another material sample. It's a book cover that has a diffuse base layer and an interestingly worn and wear and tear on a sort of more glossy top layer. You can see, there's interesting scratches and normal variations in glossiness and so forth in the real photograph. And you can see that we've actually, our rendering or our result reproduces this pretty accurately. Here's a bathroom tile. Nothing fancy about this. The thing to note is that we even though we assume a planar material, we do capture some of the sort of millimeter deep bumps in this material as well. I hope I'm not blocking you overly bad. And again, it's 2 triangles plus some texture maps, and that's it. Here's a more complicated material sample with some paper, some different kinds of tape, duct tape, Jeesus-tape, packing tape, different kinds of glossinesses, different kinds of glossinesses, surface textures, wear and tear, scratches, pencil markings, what have you. And again, here you can notice that our result, visually, you can't tell the difference all that well, except in the area where our sample is not actually fully planar and we get shadows, which is something that we don't support. You don't see these shadows in here, but you can see that our algorithm doesn't really break in here either. Here's one final sample, but in the interest of time, I'm going to skip it. And this is just to demonstrate that, yes, you can render free viewpoints and lighting conditions on any one of these material samples. And to really demonstrate how simple this data is, this material is reproducible from a few texture maps, as I said. So it consists of just the diffuse texture, like your normal texture map, the specular color texture, how bright the specular part is, glossiness, which just says how narrow the specular reflection lobe is at a given point, something that also has to deal with the shape of the specular lobe, and the normal map, and you can see lots of interesting detail in there. I am going to skip the limitations and say that in this work we believe we've demonstrated the first system that uses nothing but a camera and a monitor that's pervasively available. No custom hardware, no special anything that gives you reflectance, diffuse plus specular plus normal reflectance that matches ground truth pretty well. And we are releasing the code and the data to this project, hopefully next week, so you can play around with it. Unfortunately, you will need a MATLAB license to do it, since we haven't. That's where we operate. So I had more slides about the things that I teach at Aalto, but since we're running out of time, I will just, 2 minutes. So I will not thank you yet. And I will still mention that I am teaching computer graphics both at the intro and advanced level at Aalto. If you're interested, if you're enrolled in a school that has your deals with Aalto, you're very welcome to take my classes. Intro class is overview of everything in graphics. Advanced class is going to be realistic image synthesis. So in the advanced class, you learn to do indirect illumination and things like this. Also in real time, by the way. We do lots of coding. People tend to do more than I ask for because it's fun, which I think is great. Where we have competitions. In the intro class last year, I got 3 students who did the most work. Some private FaceTime with the people who write the engine at Remedy, which is pretty cool. We have actually one of them in the audience here, who's now working for Remedy as a summer job. In the advanced class, we had a rendering competition where NVIDIA donated a GeForce Titan as the main prize. And the competition was juried by the guy who leads the rendering R&D department at Weta Digital. You may have heard of their movies, The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and these sorts of things. And I really plan to continue doing this sort of thing in the future. So with that, it's time to end, and thank you. And I'm just going to tell you, keep doing what you love. It's going to end up in great results. Thank you. Right? Do we have time for questions? or not? No, I'm afraid. Okay. Well, you can, I'll stick around. You can come talk to me afterwards if you want. All right, thanks.